The morning the widow walked through Ashcombe village, the bells did not ring, yet every whisper did. A pale mist clung to the cobblestones like a guilty secret, and the great estate upon the hill slept in wounded silence, its iron gates rusted by 5 long years of abandonment. Shop windows reflected her passing figure in dim fragments, black silk hemmed with patience, gloves mended too often, posture unbroken despite the invisible weight of judgment. People paused in their errands, not from courtesy, but from curiosity sharpened into cruelty. They had watched her survive where scandal was meant to destroy her. They had waited for her to vanish. Yet she remained, walking with 2 children at her side, each step a quiet rebellion against a society that preferred its sinners invisible and its widows obediently erased. She was called Mrs. Eleanor Vale now, though once her name had shimmered in ballrooms and candlelight. The past lingered in the slope of her shoulders, in the way she still inclined her head with aristocratic grace even as she purchased bread with careful coins. Her son, Thomas, kept close, solemn-eyed, already learning the discipline of silence. Her daughter, Margaret, clutched Eleanor's gloved fingers with innocent trust, unaware that the world had already begun measuring her worth. Around them, conversations folded into murmurs. A noblewoman's laugh fell abruptly quiet. A clergyman adjusted his collar rather than greet her. Another mother drew her child aside, as if disgrace might leap from Eleanor's shadow. Eleanor felt each rejection like cold rain beneath silk, yet her expression never pleaded. Dignity, she had learned, was a widow's last untouchable possession. Ashcombe Estate loomed above the village like a forgotten crown. Its windows, once bright with chandeliers and orchestras, now reflected only sky and crows. 5 years ago its master had vanished into war and rumor, leaving halls full of dust and unanswered questions. It was there Eleanor had been permitted to remain, first by necessity, then by indifference. The servants treated her kindly, but carefully, as if kindness itself required restraint. They knew she was not merely a guest, nor merely a trespasser. At night, when the children slept, Eleanor wandered its corridors, fingertips brushing wallpaper faded from gold to ghost. She remembered laughter in those rooms, remembered a voice promising return. Memory, like fire, both warmed and wounded her. Each morning she rose before regret could claim her courage, and she taught her children to stand straight in a world eager to bend them. That morning in the market, the cruelty sharpened. Lady Harcourt, wrapped in velvet privilege, paused beside the flower stall just as Eleanor reached for daisies. Her gaze slid to the children, then back to Eleanor's morning dress, lingering too long to be accidental. "How industrious," she said softly, her smile thin as glass. Eleanor inclined her head. No apology left her lips, nor explanation. She would not offer her life for inspection. Yet Margaret sensed the tension and pressed closer, whispering, "Mama, why do they look at us so?" Eleanor's throat tightened, but she answered gently, "Because some hearts are louder than their manners." The child accepted this as truth and leaned into safety, while Thomas watched Lady Harcourt retreat, already learning who to remember and who to forgive. By afternoon, clouds gathered like conspirators over the hills. Eleanor returned to the estate with damp hems and restless thoughts. In the great hall, firelight barely conquered the chill, casting long shadows across portraits of ancestors who had never imagined such disgrace beneath their frames. She removed her gloves slowly, as if ceremony itself could keep chaos at bay. The children sat near the hearth, sketching castles they pretended belonged to them. Eleanor observed them with quiet ache, for every joy they knew had been carved from restraint. She wondered, as she often did, whether love alone was enough armor against society's blades. The estate creaked with loneliness. Wind slipped through cracked windows like unanswered questions. Somewhere in its bones lived a promise long neglected, and Eleanor felt that promise stir, restless as fate waking from sleep. Outside, hooves struck stone. The sound came first as rumor, then as certainty. Eleanor froze, hands stilling against the mantel. Carriages had not climbed that road in years. The servants exchanged glances thick with disbelief. Curtains shifted. A dark shape emerged through the mist, wheels turning with purpose rather than memory. The children rose, curious, faces glowing with expectation Eleanor had learned to fear. She moved toward the window and saw it. A black carriage trimmed in silver authority, horses breathing steam into the cold air, a crest upon the door she had not dared imagine again. Her pulse struck louder than the hearth. The estate, which had slept in resignation, seemed suddenly to inhale. Somewhere beyond the iron gates, destiny adjusted its gloves and prepared to enter uninvited. The carriage slowed, heavy with return. Eleanor's reflection stared back from the glass, pale yet resolute, a widow fashioned by abandonment but not defeated by it. Thomas stepped closer, sensing history in the air. "Mama," he asked quietly, "who comes to a house that belongs to silence?" Eleanor did not answer at once. Her heart carried too many years for simple words. She watched as the carriage door began to open, as boots touched the gravel of a forgotten home, as the past finally chose to stop running. In that suspended breath between fear and revelation, Eleanor understood that shame had been only the beginning. Whatever crossed those gates would not merely change her life, it would demand it back, piece by trembling piece. The front doors of Ashcombe groaned open as though the house itself protested resurrection. Cold air surged inside, stirring dust from forgotten corners, and with it entered the Duke of Ravensmere. His coat was dark with travel, his shoulders rigid from years of command, yet his eyes carried the unsettled quiet of a man who had outlived certainty. Servants froze mid-step, disbelief written across their lowered gazes. 5 years ago, he had vanished into war, into politics, into distance sharpened by pride. Now his boots struck marble with unfamiliar authority, echoing through corridors that once knew his laughter. He paused, breathing in the scent of old firewood and faded roses, sensing that the estate no longer belonged solely to memory. Something lived here now, something unaccounted for in his long, regretful absence. He crossed the threshold into the great hall just as Eleanor turned from the hearth. Firelight lifted her silhouette from shadow, outlining black silk, pale throat, and the 2 children beside her. Time, which had marched obediently for 5 years, shattered into stillness. The Duke stopped as though struck by fate itself. Eleanor's breath caught, not in greeting, but in restraint, the practiced composure of a woman long accustomed to surviving shocks without surrendering dignity. Thomas stood protectively before Margaret, eyes studying the stranger with instinctive seriousness. The Duke's gaze moved from Eleanor's face to the children's forms, small and unmistakably alive, and then back again, as if searching for an explanation written in flesh. No words came. Only the fire spoke, snapping softly between disbelief and recognition. "Your Grace," murmured a servant, but the title sounded foreign in the frozen air. The Duke finally exhaled, the sound rough with restrained emotion. His eyes, steel sharpened by command, softened into something dangerously human. "Mrs. Vale," he said, voice formal, yet trembling beneath its polish. Eleanor inclined her head, not in welcome, but in acknowledgment of fate. "My lord." 2 syllables carried years of abandonment, secrecy, and survival. The children watched, sensing the gravity of a moment too large for childhood language. Margaret whispered, barely audible, "Mama, he looks like your stories." Eleanor's fingers tightened around hers, warning and comfort combined. The Duke heard the whisper and flinched, as though truth had brushed too close to his skin. Within hours, Ashcombe stirred like a nest struck by sudden light. News traveled faster than horses. Curtains twitched in the village below, and aristocratic households sharpened curiosity into speculation. The Duke's return was not scandal alone. The widow and her children transformed it into provocation. Eleanor felt the shift as servants moved differently, respectful yet alert, kindness edged with caution. That evening, when the estate quieted into uneasy order, a small parcel appeared outside the nursery door. Inside lay leather-bound storybooks, wool cloaks stitched with care, and shoes polished as if meant for ceremony rather than survival. No signature accompanied them, only intention. Eleanor understood at once whose hands had chosen those objects. The gift was protection disguised as courtesy, tenderness disguised as authority, and she felt both gratitude and danger unfold within her chest. Thomas examined the shoes with wonder he refused to voice. Margaret twirled in the cloak, laughing softly. Eleanor smiled for them, though her heart beat with complicated rhythm. Tokens carried weight in aristocratic worlds. They invited interpretation sharper than knives. By morning, whispers threaded through Ashcombe like fog. A maid paused too long at the doorway. A footman avoided Eleanor's gaze. In the breakfast room, Silverware rang with deliberate distance. Lady Harcourt arrived unannounced before noon, her presence perfumed with curiosity. Her eyes traveled first to Eleanor, then to the children, then toward the corridor where the Duke resided. "How fortunate," she remarked sweetly, "that His Grace returns to such domestic surprises." Eleanor met her gaze calmly. "Fortune," she replied, "often disguises itself as consequence." Lady Harcourt smiled, but her silence sharpened. By afternoon, the Duke summoned Eleanor beneath pretense of courtesy. They met in the long gallery where portraits listened better than people. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, catching dust in golden confession. He stood near a painting of his ancestors, hands clasped behind him, posture disciplined yet uncertain. "I did not expect to find Ashcombe altered," he began. Eleanor answered without accusation. "Nor did I expect to raise children beneath its roof." Their eyes held, polite restraint battling private storms. He glanced toward the corridor, where faint laughter escaped from Margaret. Something fractured behind his composure. "They are yours," he said carefully. Eleanor lifted her chin. "They are mine to protect." The space between them pulsed with unspoken questions neither dared yet release. Courtesy became armor, but armor rattled under longing. The Duke dismissed her gently, yet conflict lingered like heat after flame. That evening he walked the estate gardens alone, fingers brushing hedges that remembered different seasons. He watched from a distance as Eleanor taught Margaret to read by lantern glow and as Thomas corrected her patience with brotherly seriousness. The sight unsettled him more than battlefields ever had. Later, another parcel arrived, a silver locket, modest yet unmistakably noble. Eleanor opened it slowly. Inside lay no portrait, only empty space waiting for meaning. A message without ink, a promise without declaration. She closed her fingers around it, feeling destiny settle coldly into her palm. Tokens were no longer kindness. They were confession forming shape before courage found words. The next morning, scandal bloomed fully awake. Village women clustered near the gates. A minister hesitated before greeting Eleanor. Even the servants spoke in half-sentences, afraid of loyalty's cost. Margaret tugged Eleanor's sleeve and whispered, "Why do they watch us?" Eleanor knelt, meeting her daughter's gaze. "Because change unsettles those who fear truth." Thomas, listening, looked past her toward the manor windows, where the Duke stood unseen. The child's eyes narrowed with quiet realization. That afternoon, as Eleanor prepared tea, Thomas approached her solemnly. "Mamma," he asked, voice steady yet curious, "is the Duke the gentleman who promised never to leave you?" Eleanor's hand trembled against porcelain. The question fell like a bell into silence, and in its echo, the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the answer that would no longer remain hidden. Night settled over Ashcombe with the patience of confession. Rain traced thin silver lines along the tall windows, and within the house the corridors breathed like restrained lungs. Eleanor moved quietly, leaving the children wrapped in sleep, their faces softened by dreams she guarded fiercely. A single candle guided her toward the library, where the Duke had requested her presence with a formality too deliberate to ignore. Books rose along the walls like witnesses, their spines dulled by age and memory. Firelight trembled across leather and mahogany, and in its glow stood the Duke of Ravensmere, no longer armored by daylight ceremony. His coat was set aside, his sleeves rolled with uncharacteristic humility. He did not turn at once. Instead, he listened to her approach, as though every footstep measured the distance between past promise and present consequence. When he faced her, restraint battled emotion across his features. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Vale," he said, voice low, weighted with dignity. Eleanor inclined her head, hands folded before her as if holding years together by will alone. Silence stretched, broken only by rain and fire. The Duke gestured toward a chair but did not sit himself. "Ashcombe has learned new rhythms," he continued. "Children's laughter carries differently than memory." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "So does abandonment," she replied softly. The word did not accuse, yet it refused mercy. His jaw tightened, then eased. "I did not summon you to wound you," he said, "nor to defend myself. I summoned you because the truth has been walking my halls, and I will no longer pretend blindness." The candle flickered, gilding his eyes with something dangerously sincere. Eleanor remained standing. "Truth," she murmured, "rarely announces itself politely, my lord." He drew a breath, long and disciplined, the sort soldiers learned when chaos threatened order. "Those children," he began, then stopped, correcting himself with care. "Thomas and Margaret. They look at this house as if it belongs to their future." Eleanor's throat tightened, yet her voice remained composed. "It belongs to their safety." He nodded. "And does their safety include me?" The question trembled beneath etiquette. Eleanor finally crossed the room, stopping near the hearth, firelight sculpting the lines of sacrifice upon her face. "It includes honesty," she answered. 5 years ago you promised return. You promised protection. Then war, distance, pride, and silence became my only companions." Her hands curled slowly, not in anger, but memory. "When I discovered I carried your child, the world grew suddenly sharp. Letters went unanswered. Doors closed. So I stayed. I survived." The Duke's composure cracked like thin ice beneath weight. He stepped forward, stopping short of impropriety, yet close enough for shared breath. "I never received those letters," he said. "They vanished between battlefields and political exile. I crossed oceans believing myself alone, yet my soul never left this house." The words left him like confession rather than argument. Eleanor's eyes shimmered, though tears did not fall. "Loneliness does not measure itself by geography," she replied. "It measures itself by silence." He lowered his gaze, humbled by her endurance. "You deserved my presence," he admitted. "Instead you bore disgrace alone." Eleanor inhaled slowly, the kind of breath one takes before standing against storm. "Disgrace was never the child," she said. "Disgrace was abandonment without explanation." Fire popped softly, as though agreeing with her courage. For a moment neither spoke. Then the Duke looked toward the shelves, as if books might offer refuge from accountability. "Thomas has my eyes," he said quietly. Eleanor's breath faltered, not in surprise, but in recognition long carried privately. "Margaret has your patience," she answered. The exchange hovered between vulnerability and revelation. He turned back to her, voice lowered to reverence. "You raised them with strength I did not earn." Eleanor lifted her chin. "Strength is learned when choice disappears." He hesitated, then reached out instinctively, stopping inches from her hand, Victorian restraint burning hotter than touch. "Every night I imagined Ashcombe frozen in the past," he whispered. "I did not imagine life blooming without me." Eleanor felt the nearness of him like heat against winter. "Life rarely waits for permission," she replied. Their hands remained suspended between propriety and longing, trembling with unspent years. The Duke withdrew first, not from rejection, but respect. "Society already sharpens its knives," he said. "Your presence, the children, my return. Together they provoke more than curiosity." Eleanor smiled faintly, not in humor, but endurance. "Let them provoke," she answered. "I have learned that dignity outlives gossip." He studied her, admiration replacing guilt's shadow. "You walk like a woman who has buried fear," he said. Eleanor's voice softened. "No, my lord. I simply taught fear to stand behind my children." The Duke absorbed her words as if each syllable rewrote his understanding of honor. Rain pressed harder against the windows, echoing the storm within his conscience. A sudden sound interrupted them. Footsteps brushed the corridor beyond the library door, hesitant yet deliberate. Eleanor stiffened. The Duke turned sharply, instinctively protective now rather than commanding. Shadows shifted beneath the doorframe, and a breath caught in the silence. Someone lingered, listening, curiosity sharpened by scandal. Eleanor's pulse quickened, yet she did not retreat. The Duke lowered his voice. "Whatever has been overheard," he murmured, "will not remain harmless." Eleanor met his gaze with calm courage. "Truth never does," she answered. The footsteps faded, leaving tension coiled behind absence. Firelight flared, illuminating resolve within both their faces. The Duke straightened, decision forming like steel beneath silk. "This house no longer belongs to ghosts," he said quietly. "It belongs to consequence." Eleanor felt the meaning settle in her bones. He reached into his coat and drew out the silver locket she had closed days earlier. Opening it, he placed within a small folded paper. She watched, heart steady yet expectant. He handed it to her without flourish. Inside, written in careful script, were only 4 words: "I will not flee again." Eleanor's breath caught, not with relief, but with the terrifying promise of change. As thunder rolled beyond Ashcombe's walls, she realized confession had only begun, and destiny now waited for its boldest answer. Ashcombe awakened beneath chandeliers once more, their crystal throats clearing 5 years of dust with trembling light. Carriages arrived in obedient procession, wheels murmuring privilege across gravel that had forgotten ceremony. Silk and wool, perfume and judgment, drifted through the reopened doors as the county assembled to witness the Duke's resurrection. Music stirred cautiously, violins testing whether the house still remembered grace. Servants moved with rehearsed elegance, yet their eyes betrayed anticipation sharper than hospitality. Tonight was meant to celebrate Ravensmere's return, yet beneath every courtesy lived a single question: who truly belonged beside him now? Eleanor stood in her chamber, fastening a gown that had once known brighter seasons. The fabric was modest, yet cut with quiet nobility, black softened by moonlit blue. Margaret watched from the bed, braiding her own hair with fierce concentration. Thomas adjusted his collar, seriousness lending him borrowed adulthood. Eleanor knelt before them, smoothing their sleeves. "You will walk beside me," she whispered, "not behind." Thomas nodded, understanding more than childhood should. Margaret smiled, trusting the promise of her mother's calm. Yet Eleanor's reflection revealed tremor beneath resolve. Tonight was not invitation. It was judgment wrapped in music. When the doors of the ballroom opened, sound flooded outward like breath held too long. Light spilled across marble, catching gowns like drifting constellations. Conversations paused as Eleanor entered with her children. The pause was not respectful. It was surgical. Eyes traveled from her mourning silk to Thomas's solemn posture, then to Margaret's hopeful curiosity. Whispers stitched themselves between fans and champagne glasses. Lady Harcourt, radiant in velvet confidence, inclined her head with polished cruelty. "How courageous of you to attend," she murmured as Eleanor passed. Eleanor replied softly, "Courage is often mistaken for inconvenience." The noblewoman's smile sharpened, but she withdrew, already collecting scandal like currency. Across the room, the Duke of Ravensmere turned. Music faltered in his hearing, though violins continued their polite insistence. Eleanor's entrance struck him with greater force than any battlefield return. Firelight shaped her dignity, and the children beside her rewrote his understanding of legacy. His chest tightened, not with fear, but responsibility awakening from exile. Conversations blurred as he crossed the ballroom toward them, ignoring protocol's cautious pacing. Eleanor felt his presence before she saw him, like gravity shifting in a familiar universe. She inclined her head formally. "Your Grace." He answered with quiet intensity. "Mrs. Vale." Then, breaking etiquette, his gaze fell to the children. "Thomas." "Margaret." Hearing their names spoken by him unsettled the room more than impropriety ever could. Before further exchange could steady itself, Lady Harcourt stepped forward, voice sweetened by danger. "Your Grace," she said, "society is most curious. We welcome your return, yet we are perplexed by your guests." She gestured lightly toward Eleanor and the children, as if indicating decoration rather than people. Silence thickened. Eleanor's fingers curled, but she did not retreat. Thomas shifted protectively closer to Margaret. The Duke inhaled slowly, a commander recognizing a battlefield disguised as ballroom. "Perplexity," he replied, "is merely ignorance seeking courage." Lady Harcourt lifted her brow. "Then perhaps enlightenment is owed. A widow residing in your estate with 2 children invites interpretation." Eleanor met the woman's gaze, prepared to absorb humiliation, but the Duke moved before sacrifice became habit. He stepped between Eleanor and the assembly, authority reshaping the air. Music faded, not by command, but consequence. Interpretation, he said calmly, belongs to those who refuse responsibility. His eyes traveled the room, steady as oath. Ashcombe is my house. Its guests are my concern. Murmurs rose, restrained yet electric. Lady Harcourt tilted her head. Then you claim them, she pressed. The Duke turned toward Eleanor, hesitation flickering like candle flame. In that fragile second, Eleanor felt history pause, waiting for bravery rather than manners. His voice lowered, yet carried. I claim truth, he said. And I claim honor long delayed. He reached for Eleanor's hand. Gasps rippled through silk and feathers. Her skin warmed beneath his gloved certainty. Eleanor's breath faltered, but she did not pull away. The Duke faced the room again. 5 years ago, I left Ashcombe believing duty lay elsewhere. In doing so, I abandoned more than walls. I abandoned promise. His gaze softened toward the children. These lives continued without my courage. That failure is mine, not theirs. The words traveled like stormlight through assembled judgment. Lady Harcourt's smile thinned. You endanger your title with sentiment. The Duke answered, titles exist to protect people, not erase them. Then, without ceremony's permission, he knelt before Eleanor. The room inhaled as one. Chandeliers trembled with the audacity of devotion interrupting protocol. He held her hand gently, reverently. Eleanor Vale, he said, voice stripped of rank yet strengthened by truth. You bore what I neglected. You guarded what I fled. Before society, before consequence, before pride, I acknowledge you and these children as my responsibility and my heart. Eleanor's eyes shimmered, though tears remained disciplined. The children stared, astonished by history bending toward them. Margaret whispered, Mama. Eleanor looked down, seeing not scandal, but survival made visible. The Duke continued, I will not hide you in corridors of convenience. I will stand with you in light and judgment alike. The silence following his vow pulsed louder than applause ever could. Thomas moved first. He stepped from Eleanor's side, small boots sounding braver than they felt. He approached the Duke, studying him with a seriousness born of premature understanding. The Duke lifted his gaze. Thomas hesitated, then placed his small hand into the Duke's larger one. The gesture shattered restraint more than words. Whispers dissolved into awe, offense into astonishment. The Duke swallowed, emotion-piercing composure. He rose slowly, drawing Eleanor and the children beside him, no longer guests but center. Around them, society recalculated its cruelty. Some eyes softened, others hardened. But none could deny the transformation unfolding beneath crystal light. Music dared to breathe again, tentative, respectful. Servants resumed movement, though reverence replaced routine. Lady Harcourt retreated, defeated by dignity she could not fracture. Eleanor felt the ballroom's weight shift from accusation to possibility. Yet even as warmth brushed her courage, uncertainty lingered like distant thunder. The Duke leaned closer, voice meant only for her. Standing publicly is the beginning, not the end. Eleanor met his gaze, steady yet searching. Beginnings, she replied, are where the heart risks everything. As violins swelled around them, she understood the storm had not passed. It had only chosen its most dangerous, beautiful direction. Dawn crept across Ashcombe with the quiet reverence of forgiveness. After the storm of chandeliers and scandal, the estate breathed differently, as though walls once stiff with tradition had learned to soften. Mist drifted through the gardens, settling upon roses that had waited years for attentive hands. Eleanor stood upon the eastern balcony, wrapped in a shawl the Duke himself had placed around her shoulders before leaving her to rest. Below, dew traced silver upon gravel paths, and birds rehearsed courage in tentative song. She watched the light grow, aware that her life, long governed by endurance, now trembled on the edge of chosen happiness. Footsteps approached with familiar restraint. The Duke of Ravensmere emerged from shadow into morning, his presence no longer armored by title alone, but by intention. He paused beside her, hands folded behind him, gazing across the land he had reclaimed and the woman he feared losing. "Ashcombe greets you differently," he said softly. Eleanor turned, studying the man whose absence had once defined her survival. "It greets truth differently," she replied. The wind brushed her hair loose from careful pins, and he resisted the instinct to touch, honoring the slow reverence she deserved. Their silence held more tenderness than speeches ever could. Beyond the balcony doors, Thomas and Margaret stirred awake, laughter whispering through corridors still learning joy. Eleanor listened, her heart tightening with love sharpened by years of restraint. "They deserve certainty," she said quietly. The Duke nodded, eyes steady. "So do you." He reached into his coat and withdrew the silver locket, now worn smooth by thought rather than ornament. Opening it, he revealed a miniature portrait newly placed inside. Eleanor sketched in candlelight, her expression neither widow nor scandal, but woman reclaimed by dignity. Eleanor's breath caught, emotion rising without permission. "You see me," she murmured. The Duke answered simply, "At last." They descended into the gardens together, where morning painted everything with mercy. Thomas approached first, no longer cautious, curiosity blooming into belonging. "Sir," he said, posture stiff yet hopeful, "will you stay this time?" The Duke knelt before him, lowering rank into humanity. "If you will have me," he replied, "I will remain where courage matters more than distance." Thomas studied him, then nodded with grave approval. Margaret followed, slipping her small hand into the Duke's without fear. The warmth of her trust reshaped his understanding of legacy. Eleanor watched, tears finally daring to surface, not from sorrow, but from reunion life had delayed. Later, the estate gathered beneath open sky. Servants, villagers, and reluctant aristocrats assembled in uneasy harmony, summoned not by command, but by rumor transformed into anticipation. The Duke stood before them with Eleanor beside him, children framed by sunlight rather than shadow. His voice carried without cruelty. "Ashcombe once ruled by distance," he said. "Today it stands by devotion." He turned to Eleanor, gaze reverent. "You taught this house what survival costs. I intend to teach it what love protects." Murmurs shifted, judgment loosening into curiosity, curiosity into respect. Eleanor felt the past finally loosen its grip upon her shoulders. The Duke then faced her fully, the world narrowing into the space between their breaths. "Eleanor Vale," he said, no longer Duke first, but man restored, "5 years ago I left believing honor lived elsewhere. I was wrong. Honor lived here, in you, in the children I failed to claim. I ask now, not as obligation, but as devotion, will you walk beside me as my equal, my home, my future?" His voice did not tremble, but hope shimmered beneath every syllable. Eleanor's heart struck fiercely, memories colliding with possibility. She lifted her chin, eyes bright with unshed years. "I walked alone because I had no choice," she answered softly. "I survived because my children needed strength more than comfort. If I walk with you now, it is not because I am rescued, but because I choose." The Duke's breath slowed, reverence shaping his posture. Eleanor continued, "I choose honesty over fear, belonging over exile, love over endurance." She placed her hand within his. The estate seemed to inhale. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying 1,000 restrained tomorrows. Applause did not erupt at once. Instead, silence honored them first, then warmth unfolded into sound, approval rippling like tide upon shore. Bells from the village chapel rang, unplanned yet perfectly timed, their voices drifting through gardens like benediction. Servants smiled openly. Even former critics bowed their heads, forced by courage greater than custom. The Duke drew Eleanor closer, not in possession, but partnership. "You have returned my soul to this house," he murmured. Eleanor smiled through tears. "And you have returned our future to itself." The children stood between them, hands linked, a living emblem of reconciliation stronger than scandal. As afternoon leaned into gold, Ashcombe transformed. Windows opened. Laughter wandered corridors once hollow. Eleanor walked with the Duke through rose paths, her steps no longer measured by defense, but anticipation. He stopped beneath an ancient oak and faced her once more. "Love is not a rival," he said. "It is courage repeated," Eleanor answered. "Then let us repeat it daily." He finally brushed his lips against her knuckles, a gesture restrained yet burning with promise. In that touch, abandonment surrendered to belonging, and shame dissolved into legacy reborn. When sunset painted the estate in amber quiet, Eleanor stood upon the balcony again, now with the Duke beside her and children chasing fireflies below. The world felt larger, kinder, yet still demanding courage. The Duke whispered, "Every ending is a beginning disguised." Eleanor leaned into him, heart steady with chosen faith. Ashcombe no longer waited in silence. It lived in devotion, in whispered vows, and in a love brave enough to be seen.